So today on ICMDA webinars, we have Dr. Catriona Waitt. So leading when people say you can't. Diversity is God-given, and it means that each of us can bring something unique to our workplaces and societies. Unhelpful stereotypes of leadership still exist in medicine and in academia, which may result in some very gifted people feeling that they do not belong in a leadership role. And in this webinar, Dr. Waitt will challenge some stereotypes and encourage you to see that God needs a diverse range of Christians in leadership roles. She aims to give the type of talk that she would have liked to have heard about 20 years ago, and will aim to empower you to and envision you as to how you can embrace the opportunities to serve God in your career. So Catriona Waitt is a physician, and she's NIHR Professor of Clinical Pharmacology and Global Health at the University of Liverpool. She lived in Malawi for 4 years during her PhD, and since 2015, she's been based largely in Uganda at the Infectious Diseases Institute at Makerere University, where she leads the Maternal and Infant Lactation Pharmacokinetics, MILK is the acronym, and Attaining Equity of Access to Research programs. Her husband, Peter, is also a clinical academic, and they have five children and share the adventure of home educating them as they move around the world. So, Catriona, where are you? There you are.
I am here. Yes.
Hi, you're very, very welcome, and we really look forward to hearing you speak and to engaging you in the Q&A a little later in the program. So, thanks very much. Over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation to speak. And to be honest, when Peter did reach out to me and asked me to speak on this topic, my very first reaction was, I can't. I mean, ICMDA webinars are full of experts who speak to a particular topic area. And leadership is one of those things that I don't think by any stretch I could call myself an expert. However, I came to realize that that was kind of the point. And as Peter said, I want to try and give the kind of talk that I never heard earlier in my career. And you can contact me. There's going to be time for Q&A, but if you want to contact me offline, that is also just fine. So as mentioned, for the last 10 years, I've been leading a research group in Uganda where I look at drug safety and dosing in people who are often left out of clinical trials, so particularly pregnant and breastfeeding mothers and their babies. And that work includes clinical trials, pharmacokinetic studies, lab work, mathematical modelling, and also quite a lot of community engagement and involvement in trying to attain this equity of access to research. And outside of work, I've been married to Peter for 26 years. He's actually on a plane at the moment and not online with us. Peter is also a clinical academic. We are both consultants in acute medicine in the UK. And his research involves highly infectious pathogens, things like Ebola, maternal sepsis. And we get the pleasure of working together quite a lot. And together we've had 5 children, and we do homeschool them largely because we move around a lot, and it gives us the flexibility we need. It has been a wonderful adventure, but it hasn't always been straightforward. Now, perhaps you're wondering why I thought that I was not the right person to give a talk on leadership. And when I think about it, I think it's because I'd had some quite unhealthy examples of leadership earlier in my career. So I think many of us know the type of senior colleague that we all fear, the one that you're just waiting for them to find that one little thing you haven't done and then publicly shame you for it. And I know that type of culture does still exist. That's a very kind of dominating, autocratic, micromanaging style of leadership. And thankfully, over the last 20 years or so, times are changing and we're starting to see more ambassadorial, democratic, even servant leadership models in the workplace. I think it's important to think about our diversity because when God made us in his image, he didn't make us all the same. He made us unique. He made us have different strengths and weaknesses and personalities and styles. And that means that each of us can actually bring a different perspective into the workplace. I think diversity is one of those things we must celebrate. And as an aside, I do think that Christians should think about getting involved in diversity work, because if you don't, other people will take on those roles, and they may be voices perhaps that you don't particularly want to follow. Now, in terms of today's structure, I'm going to try and draw from some biblical principles, and I'm also going to share quite a lot of my own testimony and how, through many opportunities, but also through some fairly tricky situations, God has shown me that He is able to give me everything I need to do the work that He has called me to do. And I'm going to stop every so often and draw out some particular lessons, perhaps some application that you might learn from. And then I'll conclude with some specific things I'd like you to go away thinking about. I'm hoping that by touching on many aspects, there'll be something in this for everybody. So, starting with Moses, what I love about the Bible is that it's full of really real, fallible human beings who make mistakes, they have their weaknesses, and yet, despite that, God uses them. And I think that's great, because I can guarantee that if you're leading any kind of team, you are a fallible human leading lots of other fallible humans. And the story of Moses always makes me smile. You can read the full story I'm going to refer to in Exodus chapters 3 and 4. But think about it. God has just appeared in the burning bush and said to Moses, "Take off your shoes, for the place where you stand is holy ground." God Himself. Now, can you imagine? I mean, how many of us are wanting God to speak to us more directly? And so when God then says to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go," what does Moses do? Does he say, "Oh, praise the Lord, this is the leadership opportunity I've been waiting for all these years that I've been in the wilderness"? Well, not exactly. In fact, not at all. Moses starts off by saying, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" And God answers, but Moses comes back again, but what should I say to them? And so God tells him what he should say. But Moses, he still isn't taking it. He says, "Suppose they won't listen. Imagine they say the Lord has not appeared to you." And then God gives him some additional miraculous signs to really prove his power. But even still, Moses comes back and says, "But I'm not eloquent." And I think my favorite part is when Moses basically says, "Please send anyone else." I like that story because I wonder how many of us feel like that when we are called or challenged to step into a leadership role. How many of us could list all the reasons why we think we are not the one that is equipped? I'm not eloquent, I'm not strong, I don't have the right temperament or personality. Yes, but you might just be the person that God has put in that position. Now, for me, I did not grow up on stories of Moses. On the day I did my interview for medical school, I was 16 years old. It was the day before my mother's funeral, and at that time I had already been living away from home for several years. Well, not several years, but for some time, because I'd been taken away by social workers after I'd been hospitalized after quite a severe beating. So my childhood was anything but happy. And at the age of 16, I had never set foot in a church and I had never opened my Bible. I don't think I even knew what a Christian was, to be honest. But somehow, in God's amazing goodness, I ended up spending the summer between leaving school and going to medical school, volunteering in a mission hospital in central Thailand. Now, this is one of those very improbable stories that really probably shouldn't have happened, except that God was good. And I heard the gospel for the first time. So, growing up in the UK, I had never heard the gospel. Suddenly, I found myself in Thailand, surrounded by it. And it seemed so compelling. And I could see something different in the lives of the people around me. And I would argue, I would find new arguments. I would read bits of the Bible just to find arguments. And very patient missionaries would sit with me late into the evening, discussing what the Bible said, giving me additional books to read, giving me other resources. And by the end of 6 weeks, my life had been utterly turned on its head, and I had no shadow of a doubt that this was the truth I didn't know I'd been looking for all that time. And it was a month after that that I went to university. I remember around that time some Japanese missionaries giving me this verse saying that from John chapter 15 that you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, that you should go and bear fruit and that your fruit should remain. And I remember almost saying to God that if this is really the amazing truth that I think it is, my life is yours and I am going to serve you in as many ways as I possibly can. For me, from the kind of background I'd come from, the contrast was immense. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind that I had been translated from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. I had been living recklessly with no hope or no purpose whatsoever. And suddenly now I saw that there was truth, there was purpose, there was hope, and there was forgiveness. And Jesus himself said, "He who has been forgiven much loves much." And I knew that to be absolutely true. And for the first time in my life, I knew unconditional love. Now, of course, when you have grown up being told that you're not good enough, being told that you're useless, and getting all kinds of physical and emotional abuse, these things do leave their scars, and maybe they leave their scars all your life. But again, I see that part of as being part of God's gift to me. And please never think somebody is beyond the gospel. None of my friends could believe what had happened in the transformation. Some thought it was just a fad, I'm sure. I also discovered that God's word is a light, a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. I had never read the Bible, so I tried very hard to make up for lost time. And so at university, I used to spend the first couple of hours in the morning in detailed Bible study. And I would really encourage you, as you get more senior, as you move into different leadership roles, you must carve out and protect that time because no one's going to give it to you. I remember at the Christian Union I was attending, one of the speakers one day said, You you are doing your degrees, and yet for many of you, your Bible studies are like primary level. And that really challenged me. Paul wrote to Timothy that we should study and do our best to present ourselves to God as one approved who correctly handles and rightly divides the word of truth. And if we've been put into these roles, and we're all obviously academically able enough by the fact that we got where we are, we have a responsibility to really work at understanding and applying scripture in this modern age. So, a couple of lessons at this point is to remind you that God has a plan for your life. And to remind you, please never forget, you cannot earn God's love and grace. Whilst you are yet sinners, Christ died for you. I was so far off. There's no way I could have earned it. So I need to remember that God is never going to love me more or less than he did at that time. Do remember where you've come from. Do remember what you've been saved from. And if you're anything like me, then see some of those challenges actually as a gift. I read a really beautiful book on this topic a few years ago by Helen Roseveare, who was a CMF missionary. And she'd gone out to Zaire, as it was, or Congo, and founded a mission hospital and done really amazing things. But there had also been some real hardships. And at one point, she was back in the UK, not particularly thrilled about being there. And she wrote a book called Digging Ditches. And in that, she described how she came to see the pain and the hardship as a gift that God gave her so that she could minister to others. Perhaps 2 Corinthians chapter 1, to comfort one another with the comfort that we ourselves have received from God. And I think many of us are in that position. And finally, remain humble because without Him, we truly can do nothing. Anyway, time moved on. And as Peter said in the introduction, we went out to Malawi to do my PhD and for Peter to work in the medical school. And over time, we've had 5 wonderful, diverse children. But it hasn't always been easy. My first daughter, Eva, was born after 9 years of marriage, and I had returned to the UK for a safe delivery and gone back to Malawi when she was 3 weeks old. But for some reason that was never explained, at 9 weeks old, she had an out of hospital asystolic cardiac arrest whilst I was carrying her in Blantyre Market. And we did do immediate bystander CPR, got to the hospital, restored cardiac output. But unfortunately, she had significant hypoxic brain injury and she died 6 weeks later in Johannesburg. Now, it's quite difficult to find the words to describe that time because, on the one sense, It was personally one of the most harrowing things that we can imagine. All that hope of having a child, finally feeling we're going to be parents, and then feeling that your heart's been ripped out and thrown against the wall, and nothing is going to be the same again. And yet, somehow at that time was also the richest time we have known, because as everything else faded away, the only thing that we knew without a shadow of a doubt is the days of Revelation 21 are true. There is coming a time when there will be no more crying or sickness or sorrow or pain or death, and the Lord Himself will wipe away every tear. Trials come so that our faith, which is of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by the fire, may be proven genuine. And that was our experience. It was proven genuine first to ourselves and then probably to everybody that knew us. There were some very important lessons at that time. We we can't plan ahead. You just do not know what tomorrow brings. And Jesus said you cannot even make one hair of your head black or white. Instead, we are not to worry about tomorrow, for each day has trouble of its own. But we do know what we need to do today. We know that today we have to make the most of every opportunity, and we have to work at whatever we do with our whole hearts as working for the Lord and not for men. And I find this kind of living in the moment and holding the future lightly actually lets you dream a little bit bigger and build bigger plans because you don't idolize them, you hold them lightly. This story is relevant to you because bereavement, tragedy, hardship, life changing events, and diagnoses, they are going to happen. If they haven't happened to you yet, they will. And the question isn't so much why did that happen to me, but how can I make sense of this and how can I continue to serve God in the life that He has given me? Being good to us, God gave us another son about exactly a year after Eva died. And when he was 10 months old, we adopted a 4-month-old who promptly became very sick but made a good recovery. And suddenly there we were, plunged into this kind of really busy time of parenting. We were junior clinical academics, we were juggling a lot. And as we looked around us, we didn't always see particularly good role models of life and work and the balance. And I remember wanting to go part-time. I think I already had, but particularly when you've had a child die, you know that every single day is precious and you will not get that time again. And people would say to me, "Yeah, but get a nanny, go full-time, you can have it all." Now, let me tell you, you can have it all is one of the biggest lies that we can be told in our generation, particularly to women. You do have to prioritize. If you're a parent, in most situations, not all, in most situations, there are two parents. And what you need to do is work together, pray together, work out how you're going to balance things out. For us, my husband and I both went down to 60%. And for about 16 years, one of us had always been home with the children. The extreme photograph is us at a TB conference where we both had oral presentations and posters, and the other one would wander around looking like this. But we juggled it, we prioritized, and we decided between ourselves what was negotiable and what was non-negotiable. So some of the points I wanted to make from those lessons were that we are never promised an easy life here, but God does promise us that when we pass through the waters, they will not overflow us, and when we pass through the flames, we will not be burned, from Isaiah 43. Our faith is proven genuine. I also believe it is possible to have good life work integration. I would say integration rather than balance, because for me, they've always kind of come together. But you can't have it all. And you do need to work to establish what those priorities are. So for me, I feel that by the time I've done my clinical and academic roles, my parenting and homeschooling, and my church and my CMF activities, I actually haven't got much left. And that's okay. Leisure time might not particularly exist. And for my husband and I, we sometimes have to work a little bit harder at spending time together because at the moment we're in a season where one of us is traveling and then the other one travels. But for us as a couple, this is how we've worked it out. And I would encourage you to make such a plan with your other half. Even up until this point, though, I didn't really see myself as a leader. I saw myself as an enthusiastic clinical academic and a young parent. But things started to change in my next pregnancy. And you don't get a photograph of that because I looked so ghastly. I became really ill. I basically got hyperemesis, and that destroyed or damaged some surgery I'd had previously on my stomach. And I became so malnourished, I got all these opportunistic infections. And by the end of pregnancy, I was in and out of hospital on about 9 different drugs. And there were days when I almost didn't know if I was going to survive. And it was quite clear that there wasn't much information about the safety of these medications in pregnancy. And when I was breastfeeding again, not much information out there. And that really sort of started to bother me. Now, the reason I got quite sick, I mean, it was kind of coming. I had actually got off quite lightly in the previous pregnancies, but I have a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a kind of collagen disorder. It affects you in all kinds of different ways, but for me, it's mainly orthopedic and gastro. And the symbol for it is the zebra, because of an old story of medical students sitting in a classroom and hearing hoofs. And instead of saying there's a horse, they had to say, oh, it's a zebra. But actually, that analogy probably doesn't work in Africa because it's actually far more likely to be a zebra. And you can see me and my son running in a game park there. And some days I can run a lot. And after 15 knee surgeries, that's not bad. But some days it feels an awful lot more like this. Some days the pain is quite extreme and I can feel very sick and dizzy and fuzzy headed and really quite unwell. But the problem with it is I look exactly the same as I normally look. And so unless I was to choose to tell you, you wouldn't know. And academically, and I suppose personally to an extent, I was brought up in a culture where you must not show any weakness. Any sign of weakness would be where somebody could come in and get you. And any sign of weakness would mean you might not progress in your career. I once had a job reference that said that I was too physically frail to consider working in the tropics. And I also had a time when I went through some bullying where people said that I was emotionally very delicate. A delicate little flower, I think was the word. Obviously, they did not know me and what was going on in my life. But the reason I've raised this in this webinar is as I've become more senior, I've realized that I actually have a responsibility to open the door for other people to talk about their vulnerabilities. Gone are the days of a leader that has to be this kind of perfect, impervious person. And some of the books I've read about leadership recently talk about kind of almost like a courageous vulnerability. I think obviously we have to know where to draw the line, but by actually allowing people to see you as human and seeing perhaps sometimes that brokenness alongside the purpose and the hope, perhaps that's something like treasure in a jar of clay. So we do need to think about what other people are going through and advocate for them, but also the pain of childbearing, the pain of parenting. And parenting, for so many reasons, you have the times of deepest joy alongside the times of deepest sorrow. And that's even before you think of all those people who have things like multiple miscarriages, infertility. You just don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And I think we need to have greater compassion. And as mentioned, I started to become quite angry about the fact there was so little data for the use of medicines in pregnancy and breastfeeding. Sometimes people talk about pregnant women as being a special population, and I really want to challenge that because actually half the world is female. Most women go through at least one pregnancy and breastfeeding, and more than half of all women require some form of medication, and that's across the world. Pregnant and breastfeeding women are an essential part of every society, and yet people make all these excuses as to why they don't study the drugs they're taking and produce the evidence-based guidelines that women need to make informed choice. And I can almost remember the exact conversation in 2012. I was breastfeeding child number 4 in my professor's office. And we started talking about how do you measure the amount of drug in the breast milk when the mother's on the drug. And that night I did a bit of a systematic review or started a systematic review and realized just how big the data gaps were. As I reflected on my own experiences of having been a sick mother and had some very sick children, what I remember is feeling that there were no data, nobody listened, nobody seemed to really care. And I remember feeling utterly dismissed and disempowered. Now, if I felt like that, as somebody that apparently can be quite articulate, like how on earth might a woman who's not got much educational literacy feel? And so as the dust started to settle and I recovered my strength, I realized that the only difference really between me and any other mother facing this was that I'm a clinical pharmacologist and perhaps I can use my skills to make a difference. And so at that point, I wrote a small starter grant. I changed from a PhD in tuberculosis immunology and wrote a small starter pilot grant for lactation pharmacology. And basically, the rest really just started to take off. And so, over the past decade, the research portfolio has really built. One grant has led on to another. And with every subsequent grant, we've brought in new skills, new disciplines, new drugs, so that we're almost becoming one of the go to sites to study drugs in breastfeeding. And alongside my personal fellowships, there's been increasing collaborative clinical trials, a lot of community engagement, and then myself and different team members sitting on quite high level committees to really try and define best practice in this area globally. So, somewhere along the way, I realized that I was leading a team. And I realized that probably the only decision I had to make now was, am I going to just sort of lead passively and just muddle along? Or am I going to actually say, no, I'm going to make the effort to learn about leadership and actually be the best leader I can be? So there's another myth. There are many myths, aren't there? But one myth is that leaders are born, that a leader is a certain type of personality. You can almost see them, a stereotype in your mind of what makes a good leader. But that's not, I mean, yes, personality might help, but there's an awful lot that you can learn by tapping into networks, resources, and proactively doing your self development in this area. One of the most common questions that gets asked by students and junior doctors is, what is God calling me to do? What is God's plan for my life? And there aren't that many places in the Bible where it actually talks about calling. But it says in the book of Micah that he has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? And for me, my way of advocating for equity and justice and serving those that may be vulnerable in many different ways is through lactation pharmacology. For you, it might well be something totally different. And yes, I do have a child called Micah. So, up to this point, the lessons to think about is that through our medical work, we can serve God. We can serve others through our skills. But importantly, each of us really does bring something unique. So, I can kind of look back and see how all of the sort of trauma, even trauma from my own childhood and some of the difficulties that I was going through, that prepared me for the hardship that came with my children when they got sick. And then the lessons I learned as being partly a community member and advocate and partly a scientist, it all came together in this way. And perhaps all that time, God had been preparing me to do something that perhaps nobody else could do. So don't compare yourself to others. In terms of application, I do hope that I've woven some of the lessons and application throughout, but I would like to just conclude by hammering home a couple of points of things to think about on your leadership journey, things that have helped me. So, the first thing is, I think I said it earlier on, but do pray and study the Bible. That is the word of God that has been given to us as a gift, as a resource. And as we get busier, not just professionally, often your personal life is getting busier, your church life is getting busier at the same time. There's probably nobody that's going to hold you to task. So do ask somebody to hold you accountable. Do study the Bible, be systematic, particularly look at the real people in the Bible. There are some great stories of leaders who did things well and also who did things badly. But also, we just get to know God's character and how we can serve Him. I do also find it very helpful to read about leaders. In our house, I've usually got a biography on the go that I'm reading out loud to the children. And there are some wonderful Christian biographies, but also other leaders from different faiths and persuasions who have made a difference in the world. And I love to look not just at their victories, but also how they handle setbacks and how they respond to that and use that in their development. In terms of leadership books, what I do is I tend to find leaders that I respect and admire and ask them for recommendations, because there's so many books out there, and there's actually quite a lot of nonsense too. So I would ask for recommendations. And similarly, I ask for recommendations of what to listen to. I walk to work and it takes me exactly the length of an ICMDA webinar if I play it at 1.25 speed. And I find that the resource library within ICMDA is very rich, but also some leadership podcasts, sometimes webinars, sometimes sermons. But make sure you also protect the time just to not listen, just to unplug, just to let your mind wander and to really dream and strategize. And that's what I love to do when I'm running. We should seek out mentors. As you get more senior, as I keep mentioning, you have fewer peers and it can get quite isolating. It might well be that people at church don't understand the decisions you're making in the workplace. People in the workplace might not understand your faith. One example that happened to me earlier this year is I was at a meeting in a different country, and there was some discussion going on that made me deeply uncomfortable. People were basically discussing abortion as a fundamental human right that every woman should have unlimited access to for any reason, almost up to birth. And I just wanted to leave the room. I just thought, this isn't right. But I realized I'd been invited to be in that room. And if I left, who would there be there that could perhaps present the counter argument? Anyway, afterwards I felt quite conflicted and I thought, who can I speak to about this? I was in a different country. I didn't know what to do. But then I thought, John Wyatt, he'll understand. Many of you will know John Wyatt. And we had a wonderful conversation. The first part was just so encouraging that he got where I was coming from. He totally understood what I was feeling, that feeling of sort of dancing along a knife edge and having to sort of decide which things to challenge and which things to be more quiet on. But he also recommended that I put a kind of group of people around me that I can reach out to, ask them to pray when I'm going into certain situations or have certain big decisions. And that was wisdom. In the building of networks, we know as Christians that we should not forsake meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but also networks like ICMDA. In the UK, the Christian Healthcare Leaders Network, I've also found immensely helpful because people just understand what you're going through. And finally, do remain humble, remain teachable. Nobody knows it all. And actually, if you stretch yourself, you will make mistakes. You'll reflect on things that you could have done better. Be quick to apologize, be quick to learn. Don't be afraid to apologize to your team and have them sort of share your journey of growth with you. Don't be afraid to get feedback. And yes, let's learn from each other. Please remember that God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all ways, at all times, having all that you need, you may abound in every good work. We are told that. And we are also promised that His divine power has given us everything that we need for life and godliness through the knowledge of Him who called us. So God has given us what we need. So what I want you to think about is, if you're like I have been, thinking, I'm not the one to do that. I can't, I'm frail. There's so many things about me. But maybe if God is calling you to do that, He wants you to lead from that position of vulnerability and at times brokenness, and you might be amazed what God can do. I think we're now going to go into a time of questions and discussion, but as I mentioned, I'm always happy if anyone does want to reach out. I know some of the topics I've touched on have been a bit raw. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Catriona. And what an amazing talk, and just beautiful the way that you weaved in your own personal testimony and the lessons that God taught you with the things that you were bringing forth as well. And I was hugely encouraged listening, and I'm sure others would have been as well. We've got a time for question and answer now. So, Catriona, I love the way you started with Moses, and one of my heroes as well. And I've always been hugely encouraged by Moses and others like him, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Nehemiah. You know, we can think of all these people who just felt they weren't the ones. And I'm sure if you look back on your life, back to where you started at 16 in a mission hospital, knowing nothing about Christianity, and someone had said, you know, this is the path you're going to travel from now on, you just would have absolutely blown your mind. And I love particularly the way you emphasize how important it is to stay in the present and, do wholeheartedly what God has given you each day and trust him for the future rather than try to plan things out. So please post your questions. We've got the first one here from Howard Lyons, who say, given your strength of character and the many talents the Lord has endowed you with, and we all feel, don't we? Who me? How as a leader do you manage people who are lazy or less adventurous, who don't really seem up for the challenge or to walk that life of risk?
So I suppose I don't really believe that anybody actually is lazy. I think often if you think somebody's maybe not performing the way you might expect or not taking the opportunities, there is actually very often a reason for that. And often it's a reason either to do with unclear expectations that have been set, but quite often it's also something that's going on in somebody's personal life. And what I have found over time, because I do tend to be quite open, and I suppose certainly at my workplace in Uganda, I mean, my husband and I, we work in the same unit. People know the children, so there's quite a lot of transparency. I think people are more willing to tell me when something's going on in their life, and very often there is a reason. So I think one of the first things there is to not to label somebody as being lazy. I mean, maybe there are some people, but I'm actually yet to meet somebody. It's usually because of something else. In terms of being adventurous, well, see, I think I'm not very adventurous. Sometimes I feel quite scared. Um, but sometimes you just have to do it afraid. I think it was Elizabeth Elliot who said, you have to pray that God will remove your fear. And there's lots of wonderful scriptures about not having a spirit of timidity, but that of love and power and a sound mind. But sometimes you just have to step forward. And I guess I've been very blessed by the encouragement that when you do, that's when like God almost lifts you.
Yeah, I was just reading the other day, it was actually John Wayne, I think, the actor, who said that courage is when you feel afraid, but you get on the horse anyway,
Yes.
And I've always been encouraged by the Apostle Paul, who, of course, is one of my greatest heroes, the way he talks about having fears within, as he went about things, but he was obedient anyway and found God was faithful. We've got an anonymous question here. Thank you very much for your powerful and personal presentation. The alternative model of leadership you propose is interestingly not often applied when churches in the West are looking for a pastor. The multi-talented, strong, charismatic, privately educated, peaking early natural leader, the bloke worth watching, in quote marks here, is still what is often looked for and looked up to, despite this type having failed spectacularly quite a few times, notably in the Evangelical Church of England or similar churches, and we're all aware of the stories. Do you have any views on why this is the case? Why do churches sometimes, make the mistake that Samuel didn't make and choose those who are outwardly good without looking really at people's hearts, I guess? You got any thoughts on that?
I think the question in some ways is partly rhetorical because it is a huge problem, and we do still see that phenotype being favoured in certain clinical and academic circles too. But I think, Peter, you almost answered the question with that story of Samuel and saying, no, actually, we don't look at somebody's height or their stature. We don't look at the things man looks at, but we look at the heart. I wonder whether a lot of people in churches aren't confident to do that. Maybe they don't spend enough time. I don't know. And like you say, it's a repeated cycle. Maybe, Peter, perhaps you have some wisdom on that topic.
I'm not sure, but no, I think what you've just said really connects. Another question here: how has leadership worked cross-culturally? Now, you grew up in the UK. You lived in Liverpool. You've You were converted out in Thailand. You served in Malawi. You're now in Uganda. So you've been in a lot of different cultures. Some cultures are very democratic, others quite hierarchical. How does this leadership model you've described, is it something that really crosses cultures well, or are different cultures suited to different leadership models?
I mean, certainly some cultures are much more hierarchical than others. And for example, Uganda, where I currently live and work and have made my home, there are places where the hierarchies are still very important and they need to be respected. And I I actually have a one-page SOP on how to manage, how to operate me that I give my team members. And one of the points on that is that I need coaching when it comes to things like diplomatic protocol and hierarchies, because there are some styles of meeting where I need to be aware of, even down to where I sit, how I dress, just to make sure that I get it right. But I think what can also be helpful is if you just don't be afraid to ask questions and don't be afraid to apologize if you're not quite sure of how something works or what it looks like. I think people generally, although I may be mistaken, I think people generally see when you are trying to understand and to walk alongside. And if you do make a faux pas, that it wasn't a deliberate offence. But similarly, I have told all of my team members, my immediate team members, that they must tell me if, especially when it comes to things like hierarchies and how to move forward whilst keeping that. But I would say there's a difference with, say, my PhD students and the more junior scholars, where we have regular meetings as well as talking about the science. We have what I'd call like more like soft skills meetings where we talk about all kinds of things, how to give an engaging presentation, how to send an email that is polite, that makes the point, some of those skills that aren't always taught. And what I would hope is that as I mentor more junior colleagues, I can perhaps encourage them to challenge the way things have always been done. I think recognizing you will make mistakes and trying to remain respectful is key in any society.
Thank you. It was amazing to hear your own story and the way that God weaved all your various experiences right from the beginning into preparing you for what's a really very specific role of leadership, in a specific country, dealing with, drug tolerance and interactions of pregnant women and so on. And I'm sure you must have felt along the way, on many occasions, what's God doing and where's all this going? We can often have much more insight looking back. But what would you say to someone who's, much younger or perhaps earlier in their leadership journey and is facing real difficulties, which might be personal or health wise or bereavement or whatever, in terms of hanging in there for the future?
Yeah, because I mean, I condensed about 30 years of my life into about 10 minutes. And perhaps what I didn't talk about is like between perhaps graduating during perhaps my 20s, I had to deal with quite a lot of things. And that's one of the reasons we were married 9 years before having children. So there was actually quite a lot of turbulence. And sometimes in those times where you just feel utterly downcast and you're trying to make sense of the situation and things are not moving quickly. At the time, you can feel you're very much in a wilderness. And it's only afterwards that sometimes, not always, sometimes it never makes sense in this life. But sometimes you can look back and you can see actually that was the time, like when I used to run for Glasgow, and in the winter, we used to have to do winter training where we essentially ran through mud, and it kind of got us faster in the track for the summer. And sometimes we have to go through these really difficult times. But the second thing is, when I present the story like that, it can all seem quite linear. But if I was to present it as a graph, there was loads of up and downs and round and arounds. So after my PhD, there was almost like a 4 or 5 year wilderness when I didn't quite know what was going on. It wasn't that I finished my PhD one day and the ideas about lactation came up the next day. In fact, the conversation I had in my professor's office was actually a conversation about how do I leave academia without feeling that it's a failure? How do I kind of frame it as a positive choice just to go back into full-time clinical medicine? And it was almost as I sort of relinquished trying to make things happen that suddenly it all just swung around. But if it hadn't, actually to choose to go back into a different field or to slow down or to change, it's not failure. And I think these days, certainly in some countries, it's much more acceptable to change direction. So to go from clinical to academia, to go full-time, part-time, to take some time out to do something else for a couple of years and come back. It seems to be these days more acceptable. So I would say to this junior person to take one day at a time, to trust God, and to not worry what anyone thinks about you. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other, but it's never going to be linear.
Thank you. Another question, Francisco Rivas, who's from Costa Rica in the Caribbean. The word leader doesn't exist in the Bible. Rather, the Lord uses servant, which is what you've discussed today. What do you think is the Lord's intention in inspiring us to be called servants and not leaders in our work and in our lives?
Well, I think that's absolutely it. I think as we lead, we are actually serving our teams and the people around us by empowering them to really use all of their skills to the best of their abilities. So I believe that we are actually serving. And that's where flattening hierarchies, sitting around a round table, making sure that everybody has an equal voice, that's where that type of leadership really comes in. The only time when I don't use that model is in an acute clinical emergency when you actually do have to just say, you do this, you have to sort of go back into that. But so there are exceptions. There are times in a crisis where you haven't got time to make a sort of democratic decision and discussion. But I think we serve by appreciating and respecting every person and trying to help them become the best version of themselves they can be. So we do serve.
Yeah. Now, the title of this talk, of course, was "Leading When People Say You Can't," and I think there are certainly cultural contexts and church contexts, work contexts, where it's very difficult for women to step into leadership roles. And I wonder if you could just talk us through a little bit about the kind of role models, perhaps some specific role models that have been really helpful for you as a woman growing into leadership roles. You've mentioned Helen Roosevelt, already one of my personal heroes as well. But which other women in leadership have been helpful for you? Maybe some biographies as well that you've read that have helped you grow and develop.
So, I mean, I always find biographies to be helpful. I do know some missionaries who deliberately don't read missionary biographies to their children because they want their children to realize that they can be a normal Christian and they can serve in ways that maybe don't involve, crossing the sea and risking everything and doing very dramatic things. Um, it's an interesting question. Many of my mentors, the people I look up to, are in the clinical and academic sphere, are also wives and mothers who juggle different responsibilities. And I don't know whether it's partly the topic area that I work in or whether it's that I gravitate towards these people because I can relate to them. And there's a few that are just sort of five or 10 years older than me. So they're sort of one step ahead. And I have a couple of Christians in that position that I can reach out to almost any time. They're not the kind of people that would be in a prominent Christian leadership role and may not be the people that you might write a biography about, but they are people that I can always turn to and see their faith and what a difference it makes. I know I'm not particularly answering the question all that well. I think there are difficulties with women in leadership. And I guess I sometimes try to avoid the discussion, but I do personally not believe that women should be in pastoral roles. But that does not mean that I don't think women have a role. And I think this is really quite misinterpreted. People have told me they've used, the Titus chapter 2, telling me that I shouldn't be working outside the home. I've been told many things, but I don't think that's what it's saying. But I don't think women should be in pastoral leadership. But there are many ways that we can lead and serve. And I appreciate that's a very controversial topic that we could go off in a complete rabbit hole and might be actually a topic for a webinar. Yeah, so
Oh,
it's a very difficult one to answer.
no, sure. And I take your point exactly. I think there's a difference when we're talking about the church and the workplace, for example. And, you've outlined very well. Now, I was fascinated by your own story of your marriage and how you've worked together. And of course, you went through some really difficult times with illness and bereavement, losing your first child. And it's interesting the way that both you and Peter have ended up in academia, but also the way that you shared the childcare as well, working 60% each. And the one would be making poster presentations at a conference, and the other one would be carrying the baby. And I'm sure that you've been able to be a great support to one another because of your shared life experience and shared professional direction as well. But I wanted to ask you, where have you found support as you've gone through as a leader? You talked about networks and so, but tell us a little bit about your own personal support group and how that's come together.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems, if you say meet Peter and I, the way we can appear on the outside might not reflect the vulnerability we feel on the inside. And as a result, sometimes people don't realize that we need support and encouragement as much as anybody. And I would say that the Christian Healthcare Leaders Network has been absolutely wonderful. People like yourself, Mark Pickering, Chris Holcomb, all of these people that are deliberately trying to help and support and encourage people, but also have a similar theology. So people that understand, for example, what you feel like when you're in a situation where you're trying to work out if there's a moral issue or a sin issue, and you're trying to work out what your stance as a Christian might be, what things to call out, what things not to. But also people that just actually care about us as a couple and as a family. It has been difficult sometimes moving around the world and not actually being sort of in one place for all that long. Not having those long-term relationships. We're part of a very mobile society, which has many, many blessings in it. But those longer term relationships, yeah. So I think CMF, ICMDA, CHLN, and I wasn't paid to say that. I would encourage people to sign up.
Catriona, thanks so much. Sadly, we've run out of time. We could keep going on this. But again, just want to thank you for the way you've been so open and vulnerable and honest, and in telling your own story, I know has been a huge encouragement, and the way you've weaved in all these principles about leadership. And I just want to remind people of your 6 points at the beginning. Pray and study the Bible, read about leaders and leadership, listen to podcasts, webinars and so on, search out mentors, build networks, and you've talked about CHLN and ICMDA and so on, and then remain teachable. Perhaps the most important thing of all, that you feel you've never arrived, but there's always something new to learn on your journey. So we're so grateful to you. So thanks so much, Catriona. And finally, thank you so much to all of you for coming along and making these sessions so worthwhile. We look forward to seeing you again soon on ICMDA webinars. We're going to be back again next week. When I say we, I won't be here, but Josh will be back with our new speaker, Kelly Fell, and hosting next week will be Philippa Taylor, who used to work with CMF. And the subject Kate Kelly Fell will be speaking on is egg freezing and embryo adoption. So a very different kind of subject, but I encourage you to sign up and come along for that. I'll be in the US next week, but I'll be looking forward to catching up, and I'll be back the week after that. So see you soon, and may the Lord bless you in your walk and service with him. Thanks.